Again, there is a dichotomy because, you know, the markets, they didn't go to zero, and so liquidity came back, and companies were able to roll over debt, and they were able to issue debt and issue equity and have some rebalancing. The people who've not been able to do that have been the household sector. So when you talk about recoveries and default, traditionally in America, when someone hands back the keys and someone says, I just can't make payments, you can actually work through the process and cajole them and reorganize and restructure the debt. And typically your recovery for the bank is 40% of the principal lent. Now, the untold story of this year is that's collapsing. Today, the recovery rate is 6%. So the great difficulty we have in your market, Bill, is that it's something of a relay race, that we're all joined together, and that the corporate sector really is only as strong as its consumer. And if the consumer falters, of course, it's reflected in declining revenue, and then profits contract, and then you have difficulty again with leverage. So I'm seeing still intense pressure, especially in America, at the consumer level, which could backfire, as you say, in 2010.
No, I think that's an excellent point, because while we are all
Switzerland. Hugh, let's come back to you and let's pick up with a few more of our emails. Stephen writes in and says, "Wake up, Hugh. We're at the beginning phase of the biggest bull market in history. Here is why. Most American companies have shown increasing earnings by cutting costs to the bone. They are now lean and mean. Together with a weak dollar, they will outsell most of the industrial economies. These companies will show stellar earnings."
There's a grain of truth in that, which I think is certainly with regard to the dollar. The dollar is incredibly cheap. I think sterling is incredibly cheap. And therefore, as an American company, your costs are definitely pared down to the bone. Your currency is cheap. Why not? The beginning of a stellar bull market, a generational bull market, I think that is misplaced. And the reason why I say that is, again, I just think we've tapped ourselves out. The elephant in the room that we haven't discussed, I'm afraid it's boring, but it's still a fact, is that the leverage, the inheritance, if you will, of debt being 4 times, so being $53 trillion when the economy in America is $14 trillion. That's what I fear. In 1921, John Maynard Keynes wrote a book, a little pamphlet called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. So after the Treaty of Versailles, the French and the British had demanded that the Germans pay reparations, and they demanded 2.5 trillion US dollars, if we put it in our money, in our monetary terms. Too great. That legacy of debt squashed the vitality of the German, indeed the European economy, and created the distortions and the horrors of the 1920s and subsequently the 1930s. I think here we are 1 year on from the bailout, and really we should be talking about the economic implications of the bailout was that we left in place that legacy of debt. And having done nothing with regard to that, it is pressing down harder and harder. And presently, the brunt of that is being borne at the individual level, at the household level. Presently, the corporate sector has kind of escaped that. But they're joined at the hip. You can run, but if your partner is troubled, you can't run very fast. So I still dispute the notion of maybe of a next 20-year generational bull market. I think we're in a generation where returns disappoint until we deleverage the economy.
Maybe this is a naive view, but hasn't the reduction in interest rates effectively lightened that burden of debt? So even as the debt is still being carried by many households, the fact that we've seen a slashing of interest rates across Western economies means that the servicing costs, at least, of that burden have lightened. Yeah. That allows some room, doesn't it, for manoeuvre?
I think that's an excellent point, but that's a point which is specific to certain countries. Those countries would be the UK, and they would be especially in Australia. In Australia and the UK, mortgages are floating, and so when the central bank cuts or raises rates, it passes through immediately. That is not the case in America. The American mortgage is financed off the 30-year government security, and banks no longer offer teaser rates. That's what you get. You get the 30-year. And again, one of the misgivings is, okay, if everyone wants to come on and say, oh, Hugh, you're talking rubbish, and fair enough, with regard to bonds, so sell the bonds. Sell the bonds. And let's watch what happens if the 30-year US government yields 5 or 6 or 7. And let's watch that in an environment of this great debt which hasn't been addressed. I fear the consequences of that. And that's where we're heading. We're heading with this great enthusiasm in the other asset classes to push those yields higher. Just watch for the consequences.
We'll be back with Hugh shortly.